the idea of expression is important. Motherhood is incredibly multifaceted and it's a very complex and nuanced experience. And very often what we see is that people tend to or only allow for like one little facet of it. And it's like the very shiny, grateful, happy, blissful mother that just loves her children and is just so happy to be a mom. And there's a lot of shame and guilt around the other sides of that are maybe more negative.
Welcome to Worthy Mother Podcast. I'm your host, Emily Hardy, a mom of two on a mission to help moms everywhere feel less alone. This is not a parenting podcast. Instead, it's a space for pushing back against societal expectations of perfection and embracing self-compassion in your motherhood journey. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to the Worthy Mother Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about rewriting the rules of motherhood, specifically through the use of poetry, writing, and art therapy tools. So really talking about how that creative expression and understanding the experience in these creative ways can be powerful in helping us kind of understand and accept and maybe move through our own experience in motherhood. Joining us for this conversation is the incredible Grace Gulley, who graduated from UCLA's Art Initiative and who also holds a certificate in motherhood studies, which is actually where I met her. We went through the same program to become certified motherhood studies practitioners. So while the work we are doing to support mothers does look different in practice, the foundation of how we address these conversations is really aligned. So it's really exciting to be having this conversation. Grace is also a certified matrescence facilitator and has 15 cumulative years working in the arts. She is now reframing how we as a society and individuals see motherhood and perform mothering. And today we are going to get into what that can look like for us as mothers. So Grace, thank you so much for being here and sharing the incredible work that you're doing. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your background, the work that you do?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, thank you for having me here. And it's so great to reconnect and kind of see where our paths have led. I'm excited to share all of this today with you and your listeners. So I love that question of like, what's your story? What's your background? Because I could go so many different directions, but I think I'm going to start back to kind of where this whole journey began, which was in 2020 when the world was changing for everybody, myself included. So it was towards the end of March of 2020. In a single week, I found out I was pregnant, which was a little bit surprising. I hadn't exactly planned it. And I was laid off from my job 2 days after that, which was a real bummer because it was like my cool girl downtown LA job. But with that, it meant that my health insurance was going to be expiring. And then about 3 days after that, the lockdowns went into effect. So I was just like, oh, cool. What do I do next? Like, what's going to happen? And then about 2 months later, it was, I think, May 25th, we all saw the death of George Floyd. And I think mothers, me becoming a mother, all felt him calling out for his mother. And it just left so much heaviness and like, what do we do now? What do we do with this? And I spent that whole summer feeling a lot of anxiety around what does it mean that I'm going to become a mother? Like, also, I can hear from where I live in downtown LA, the protest happening. I can hear police running around down the street. I watched buildings being boarded up that summer, and I felt so much guilt and anxiety about kind of witnessing history, but very removed from it. And then there was this little tiny baby in me that couldn't consent to putting its body out there with what was happening. So I just felt like I'm this white, well-to-do woman in my high-rise in downtown Los Angeles doing nothing. And I didn't have work anymore to retreat into because who wants to hire someone that's 5 months pregnant? And the world was shut down. So all I really had time to do was think. And I thought a lot. And I didn't want to share what I was feeling with other people because I just thought I shouldn't be feeling anything but grateful. So I didn't realize at the time that I was silencing myself. And retroactively, I can say, oh, there's the conditioning that we experience as women and as mothers. So I silenced myself throughout the pregnancy and kept telling myself that, okay, when she's born, everything's going to be different. I'm going to just feel maternal bliss and just grateful and happy, and I'll have a purpose again. And then when she was born, I didn't feel any of those things. And I started feeling new guilt compounding on top of what I was feeling, that I wasn't just like so grateful for this perfect tiny little thing that was now mine to care for. So I finally decided to talk to somebody, and I reached out to my medical support team, and I heard things like, oh, this is all completely normal, or you just need to get some sleep. Good luck. Or this is baby blues. You'll be fine soon. And I felt so failed at that point and very disappointed in my what was supposed to be my support team. So that's when I started seeking answers out elsewhere, and I started turning to academics and theory. That's how I came across both Amy Taylor Kabaz and Dr. Sophie Brock, interestingly, both out of Australia. And what they taught me in both of their programs about matrisense, about the sociological and cultural systems that make up motherhood, really helped me to stop individualizing and internalizing all of the guilt I've been feeling, and to stop feeling so ashamed and be able to recognize that it's not my fault that mothering is so hard, and I'm not a bad mother. This is just, it's a really messed up system. There's a major lack of support. So while I was learning all of this stuff, I kept thinking, like, I've now been very immersed in these programs for years and years. I've had a lot of time to study them intensively, internalize what I was learning, and I wanted to bring it to other mothers without having them having to wait years to experience it. So I kept thinking, what's the answer here? Like, how do I bring this in a way that I can deliver it maybe a little bit more quickly? And that's when I came across UCLA's Art and Healing Initiative program. And they are using social emotional arts tools to facilitate healing. And I went through that program and just thought, okay, this is it. Like, this is how I help mothers reframe their relationship without necessarily having to spend years when they're past that early motherhood point. So that's kind of what led me to today. And now I'm doing poetry circles. And as a part of those poetry circles, we give a little bit of context about what the experience is, so they can hopefully disconnect from feeling like it's just me, and then allow space for healing. So that's my long story over the past few years.
I really feel like there is so much to take from that story in terms of like when you became a mother, it was this time in the world where we could like see kind of the crisis of the systems, right? Like it was very apparent back in 2020 what was going on. We all felt the trauma of that, right?
Yeah.
I think something that we have in common when it comes to how we've processed and dealt with becoming mothers in this world is the like leaning on the academic side of things and understanding really the context in a very real, well-researched way. I know for me, that's been a huge part of like the work that I do, is understanding that these are patterns that occur across the world, really. It's really a universal thing in a lot of ways that we all experience kind of this oppression in motherhood that we don't just talk about as a society in a normal setting, right? It's not something that you expect to be a part of, I guess, when you birth a baby, right? There are systematic pieces to the puzzle of why things may feel so hard, why things may not be happening the way that you think they're supposed to. Even those, shoulds that we have put on us come from these external factors. And so just acknowledging that and being able to really truly understand that can be so powerful in giving us kind of the autonomy to have our experiences be closer to how we want them to be.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Something that I would love to get into as we start having this conversation, because obviously we're going to get into how your healing through poetry works. I think it's really exciting to get to talk about that. But I want to lay the foundation of patriarchal motherhood, because that's really an important piece of the conversation, understanding what we are mothering in, the context that we're mothering in. And if we're going to be rewriting the rules for ourselves, if we want to think about how we can do this differently than we, again, think we, quote, should do, we need to understand the context. So can you just give us your explanation of what patriarchal motherhood is? I know this is something we could talk about for a very long time and write books about and all that stuff, but just in a nutshell, what is patriarchal motherhood? What are we talking about?
Okay, I'll attempt to keep this to a nutshell, because I agree. This is a topic like I get fired up and want to talk about. And I think it's really important to have this context, because my experience was that the guilt was keeping me stuck in a shame cycle of not being able to share. And the context is what kind of pulled me out of that cycle and got rid of the shame so I could start sharing and talking about my experience with others without feeling so bad about myself. So patriarchal motherhood is essentially that. It's a societal system that we're all mothering within. It's an oppressive system. I want to be careful with that word because I know that that can be triggering for people, but it is an oppressive system. And in patriarchal motherhood, it's assumed and expected that all women want to be mothers. It's essentially our final form. It's assumed and expected that all mothering will come natural and that maternal instinct is real, which there's some really interesting books and studies that have come out about maternal instinct that I think are worth people kind of digging around on. And then it's also assumed and expected that all mothers find purpose in just being a mother and they shouldn't need anything outside of that. And it relegates mothering and, in essence, women often to the private sphere, which means it's very undervalued and not something that's supposed to be seen or talked about. So that's kind of, I think, the highlights of the context for me of what we're mothering within and what we have working against us, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a great little like nutshell of what patriarchal motherhood is. So great job.
Thank you.
Great job summing it up. Yeah, and I want to just like add in there because I think it is important to acknowledge like it's not to say that all of our experiences are exactly the same, right? But it's important to recognize that still with different experiences and different levels of support and different, ways of existing in the world, just who we are, socioeconomic status, race, religion, so many factors that contribute to what our experiences are as mothers, as individuals. But to know that just in general, this is kind of a context that we all exist in. We're both speaking from the United States, but it's not just the United States that faces this system of motherhood. Understanding that is deeply important to understanding then how we can kind of separate ourselves from being the problem, because I think that is something, it feels so personal when you're feeling those feelings of guilt in motherhood that we do all feel at times.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can't say this for certain because it wasn't my experience, but I don't know how receptive I would have been to social emotional arts therapy tools if I didn't already have that context. So for me, it was vital to have the context to be able to move through that.
Yeah. I mean, I can agree completely in that. And in the work that I do, understanding the context has been the key piece in how I'm able to then have these conversations and help others. Something that I want to get into a little bit that I think is a really interesting and nuanced conversation is the personal responsibility that we all have, taking radical responsibility for our experiences and how we navigate the world. And when we talk about things like mindset and, just there's a lot of conversations happening right now that it's like, we can kind of rise above. And I think there's value in a lot of those conversations, but then there's also the systematic issues that are very, very real that impact our experiences of motherhood. I'm wondering if you just have any thoughts on how we navigate that as individual mothers.
Yeah, I agree. It's such a nuanced topic because I, one, never want to strip away hope and say like, oh, there's nothing you can do. You don't carry any responsibility. And then secondly, mothers, women already carry so much. And the more layers of marginalization you hold, the more you carry. So I want to preface this by saying, take what you need out of this. This isn't an exhaustive list or saying, these are all the things that you're responsible for. But I think how I see one of the biggest things, and again, going back to this idea of context and contextualizing your experience as far as a personal responsibility, if you can just start to understand the system that you're mothering within and become more aware, that may be a good place to start and just go so far as your capacity may allow. So broaden your understanding. And then I think another one that I would consider a personal responsibility, again, as space allows, is being able to recognize and acknowledge and ask for help when you need it. There's so many studies that say slightly different things, but no study has said that to raise a child from birth to adulthood is a one-person job. The studies that I found, it ranges between 3 to 6 full-time caregivers to do this. So to think that it's all on us, I mean, and that again is part of the patriarchal system telling us like, oh, if you don't do this yourself, if you do ask for help, then that somehow is a reflection of you as a mother. So we tend to feel a lot of hesitation or just not ask for help. So being able to reach out and get the support you need, whether that's you need to be in community with more mothers that can validate and share in your experience, or if you need a mental health professional because you're experiencing more than baby blues, but being able to acknowledge and get really comfortable asking for help unapologetically, I think would be a personal responsibility. And I think those would be two good ones to start with without putting too much on mothers.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's great about the way you've presented that too is acknowledging that in both of those kind of actions we can take, it's not a singular action, but in those, okay, I can start to understand the context, start to understand this system of motherhood that exists so that I can be more self-compassionate and understand more like the impacts. That acknowledges that in that personal responsibility, there still is the systematic pieces to it, right? And then in asking for help, also acknowledging that like that's going to be something that depending on your circumstances, depending on how you are as a human being who, may have deep rooted struggles asking for help. I mean, that's a very real piece of it. And so again, that having that self-compassion and acknowledging that those factors are influenced by this system that we have been raised in and are mothering in. And so there's so much room for self-compassion in those pieces of personal responsibility. And I think that's really important and really powerful, right?
Yeah, I'm glad it comes across that way too, because I want to make sure that I'm never putting too much on mothers and saying, this is all your fault, or there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, it's such a fine line, and it is really a challenging conversation to have. And it's not prescriptive. It's not something that we can just say, do this and your experience is going to be all that you want it to be. But acknowledging that we do have some autonomy in the situation and we can change our experiences to be not so bogged down by guilt, but then also acknowledging that we can't, as an individual, change everything for ourselves and others. And that's a really important piece to accept.
Yeah, 100% hear that.
So in the work that you do, what do you see as really the power of poetry and artistic expression in changing our perceptions and even like our individual experience of motherhood? I guess both of those pieces, like the societal perceptions and how others can perceive the experience, and then just actually how we're experiencing it.
Yeah, so I think firstly, it's the idea of expression is important. Motherhood is incredibly multifaceted and it's a very complex and nuanced experience. And very often what we see is that people tend to or only allow for like one little facet of it. And it's like the very shiny, grateful, happy, blissful mother that just loves her children and is just so, so happy to be a mom. And there's a lot of shame and guilt around the other sides of that are maybe more negative. So poetry and art is a great tool for expression because there may be a slight degree of separation between you and what you're experiencing, what you're reading. So that gives some voice and validation to possibly what you're feeling so that you feel braver in possibly telling others about your own experience. So I think the validation is huge too. And when you can see your experience in what other people are creating or writing about, and then when you can start talking about it and then have reflected back onto your own experience, it's incredibly validating and helps you feel less alone and less shame around maybe some of the more negative feelings. I also think that storytelling is a huge component to changing how we perceive motherhood, and both poetry and art are great tools for that in hearing stories of other people that perhaps share in a lot of your experiences, but maybe also have their own diverse experiences as well. And then it gives you room to share your own story. And that also expands people's perceptions on what motherhood actually is, what it looks like for different people, and what maybe they have struggled with, which then in turn will normalize it for somebody else and normalize how society sees mothers and speaks about mothering and what we make room and space for, I guess.
When you're saying all of that, it really brings me back to like why I started this podcast. It was in my own experience, particularly after having my second son, it was hearing the stories of other moms dealing with mental health struggles that were not necessarily what would, get you the check marks on the form to get help through insurance, but understanding like, oh, I am experiencing postpartum anxiety. It just looks different than, the postpartum depression that we see kind of flaunted everywhere is like, this is what postpartum depression is. And so I was able to then seek help and even have the language to then find resources to learn more and normalize my experience and understand what wasn't normal and what I needed to like get help for. And that kind of, snowball effect is what has led to now the work that I do of really having these conversations to normalize experiences. You never know what you're going to say that's going to hit someone in a way where they're like, I've never heard someone speak that experience. And yet it's something that is so relevant to my own life and how validating that can be to hear one person share something that just is similar to something you've been through. And
absolutely.
I love that there's so many ways that we can both share these things and hear them, right? Hear the experience of others and also then like be able to express ourselves what we're experiencing and how that does go so hand in hand. Like having the resources and hearing the experiences then gives us the language and the confidence and the separation. This isn't personal to then express that without the shame that so often holds us back. It's really cool to think about. And how then generationally, like if it becomes more of the norm, you think about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, like you keep going back, these conversations could not happen in the mass way that they're happening now. And so it really is, it is so hopeful, right? Like it's exciting.
Really is. Yeah. And it feels like we're kind of like the conversations are happening more, but it feels very much like we're on the precipice of starting to see things tip a little bit. And it's so exciting to be in that. And it like what you're sharing reminded me, I think it was Dr. Early Athens said, language creates worlds. And when we don't have the words to articulate how we're feeling, we become very lost. And whether that's through hearing somebody else or not, that's another great thing about art and poetry too. Like if you are using those mediums, you have another language to speak to maybe express things that you otherwise couldn't, or hear things in a way that maybe you weren't receptive to previously.
It's so beautiful. It's like listening to music when you listen to a song and it hits you in this way and it makes you cry and then you show it to someone else and they're like, I don't get it. And it's just the way we all take things in is so different and it's going to hit different chords with different people. And like how cool that you're creating spaces for that type of like self-discovery and self-expression to happen. It's like,
thank you.
So cool.
I feel super privileged and honored. Like every time I lead people through these sessions, it's honestly healing for me. And I gain something out of hearing other people's stories. And I find pieces of myself in their story. And it heals little parts of myself and my own mothering experience.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? You're getting to hear the experiences as you're also living your own motherhood experience. I think that's something too with those of us who are in motherhood support and who are actively mothering ourselves. It is really cool to get to share in those experiences with the people that we are also supporting through motherhood because it all is
absolutely
like it connects us in a really deep way.
It does. And even as people that help other mothers and are practitioners, we still are also in that experience. And I mean, I know I still need help. I still need my own support system. I still struggle in motherhood, even having the context at times. Like I may know it, and there's like a degree of separation now when things happen. I don't individualize and internalize traumatic events and struggles quite as much. But it's still hard. It's still like that conditioning is so deep that I still need the work all the time myself.
Yeah. It doesn't just go away like the years and years and years of conditioning. You can't just snap your fingers and unlearn it.
That's why it's so helpful to stay in community with other mothers too, so you can continually have those conversations.
Yeah. So for everyone who's been wondering, what does the practice of just being a part of a poetry circle and really getting into that healing experience that comes with that, what does that look like? We are going to get into that now. So I kind of want to just open the floor to you. And I know you have a poem to share with us. Just kind of explain to us what that process looks like. Maybe kind of give us an example of that.
Yeah, of course. So in the group poetry circles, for instance, I typically open them up with a small discussion and a little piece of context and let them kind of discuss where they're at right now and unpack what they're currently experiencing and thinking about. And then from there, we move into a poetry reading, and I typically will read through the poem twice. And the first read through, I always just ask that people hear what's being shared, and it's just supposed to be about a very visceral reaction to the poem. And then the second read through, it's about circling, marking, noting what is really resonant for you. And it's really important. And I reiterate this a lot in these groups that the author is not here. And really, in the context of what we're doing, it does not matter what the author meant when they wrote the poem. All that matters is how do you respond to it and what does it bring up for you? So once I read the poem, we'll have a short little discussion and then we move into writing, and I'll have a couple different prompt options and then people write. And then we all come back together to perhaps share what we wrote if we're comfortable doing that, or talk about the experience. And I do have a poem. Perhaps we can do the part where I read it to you and then we just talk about it for a minute.
I think that's a
If you're
beautiful
game.
idea. Yes, let's do it.
Okay.
This sounds fun.
Okay. So for everyone listening too, like, don't feel like you need to understand the poem. Poetry doesn't have to be intimidating. It's really how you feel about what's being said and what it brings up for you. So with that, this is called Daystar by Rita Dove. She wanted a little room for thinking, but she saw diapers steaming on the line, a doll slumped behind the door. So she lugged a chair behind the garage to sit out the children's naps. Sometimes there were things to watch: the pinched armor of a vanished cricket, a floating maple leaf. Other days, she stared until she was assured when she closed her eyes, she'd only see her own vivid blood. She had an hour, at best, before Liza appeared pouting from the top of the stairs. And just what was Mother doing out back with the field mice? Why, building a palace. Later that night, when Thomas rolled over and lurched into her, she would open her eyes and think of the place that was hers for an hour, where she was nothing, pure nothing in the middle of the day.
Chills.
Yeah, so I'd love to just hear from you, like what it recalls for you or what it brings up.
I mean, as someone with young children and one who stopped napping quite young, I remember when my first was little saying we're living nap time to nap time. Like it really got like that, especially during the pandemic. He was, 18 months when the pandemic started. And it really brings up a lot of the feelings of like, it said building that palace or creating that palace, like the space that you finally had, even though maybe the physical space was a mess and you couldn't really escape it, but trying to escape it for even the 20 minutes you had.
Yeah, that's what this brings up for me. And it's interesting because this poem was written, or it was published in the 1980s, 1985, I believe. And it reads very much like it could have been written in the 1950s or today. Which is interesting because we did, and we still, in a sense, look at Mother as totally self-sacrificial and being in complete service of our family. And in here, she's like desperately carving out just this small, minute amount of time. Like she's sitting outside watching crickets or leaves fall or just staring at the back of her eyelids because that's all she has. It resonates with me today. And it's just interesting, like that in the 1950s, people could have also heard this and been like, yes, that's also my experience. And I also want to just call out that line where Liza comes down the stairs and she says, and just what was my mother doing out back with the field mice? And it feels judgmental. Like you're doing anything but looking after me, your child, watching your family. And I love that little piece and like that layer of judgment that comes in. I love this poem. It's very, very resonant to the experience.
It really does sound like a lot of, if you just go on Facebook and look in a mom group on Facebook, it's like the poem version of, I think, what a lot of moms express, like, my kid won't nap and I need this time to have to myself and I have to get the shower in and all these things. It's like, it's such a relatable conversation.
Yeah. It's a very accessible poem and also a fairly universal experience that's just expressed in different ways, and really wanting like your own little palace. So it's a great one. And then after we would discuss the poem, I would typically have like a prompt and let everybody go off and really delve into their experience.
Do you have any prompts ready for
Oh
what we
boy,
could
you
kind
put me
of
on the
do?
spot. Yeah. So on
Okay.
this one, what I might do, because I feel like there's so many different access points, is
Hmm.
do a pure poetry therapy exercise, which in essence is just not necessarily, it's not giving a prompt. It's saying, take this poem and then take a piece of it and jump off with your own idea, whatever line is most resonant for you. So that could be, she wanted a little room for thinking. It could be building a palace. You could go from there. It could be the line when Liza comes down the stairs. Just picking a jump off point and then going. And it's very much like a free association, pure poetry therapy exercise. But that's probably what I would do with something like this poem. And something that all the listeners could do on their own now.
Yeah, I know. I think I might do that when we get off of this call. Something that I've been kind of playing with my own creativity and creative process is, as somebody who kind of grew up feeling like I wasn't very creative because I wasn't, quote, artistic. And I did an episode actually earlier this year, really getting into that, like self-expression and creativity and understanding that that's not really how it works. You don't have to be an artist to be creative. But I think sometimes we feel like we have to create something from nothing. And what I love so much about these conversations and then the kind of creative expression that can come after is that there's a starting point. So whether that's answering a prompt and like having that piece of poetry as kind of the anchor in
Mhm.
what you are now expressing, or whether it's creating your own free thinking poetry, there's enough like support under there to feel so accessible and to say, okay, we can all do that. We can all take this starting point
Yeah.
and move forward, because a lot of times in that creative expression, it really is the starting point that is
Yeah.
such a challenge. And creative expression is so important. Self-expression is so important. It's so huge. I'll say, especially for mothers who may not have that physical, the space of time or the mental, emotional space to have that ability to just express. So
Yeah.
crucial.
Yeah, I feel that. And it's interesting too, like the idea of ideation and how much of a mental and emotional toll that particular part takes. So for somebody to be able to say, I've done the thinking, the pre thinking, go from here. Like, here's a starting point. It makes it so anybody can jump in and do it. And it's interesting too, because like I feel for me in mothering, it's really the mental and emotional load that weighs me down the most, having to remember every single meal, every single snack time. Is laundry done? Do I have extra things for them before we leave the house in case something happens or in case this happens? And that is exhausting. And also going back to childhood, like it feels like for a lot of people, the idea of creativity is stamped out because it's not something that's necessarily like productive or you can monetize or capitalize on. So it's not seen as necessarily valuable. And then we end up thinking at a certain point in our adult lives, oh, I must not be creative because I
Mhm.
can't draw or I can't sing or play a guitar. When creativity is accessible for everybody. You don't have to be Picasso. Most of us never will be, but it's still available for everybody, which is great.
Yeah, you said all of that, and I know it was just in explaining why creativity can be so important. But just when you're saying like the laundry, that did you finish the laundry? Did you get the stuff ready? And it's like there's so many pressures. And then when you
Mm-hmm.
leave the house without the extra diapers and your kid has a blowout, and then the
Right.
guilt and shame that comes along with that, and just it
Yeah.
piles on. And so just acknowledging that and acknowledging how real, that's what you just said, that's what hit me. I'm like, that's
Yeah.
are you speaking to me? I
Yeah.
think I have a load of laundry in the wash that's been sitting there for I don't know how long. I need to go deal with it. But it's like there's a lot, and it's those little things, but it's also so much more. And so being able to create that intentional space to process and explore your own feelings and express your own feelings in community.
Yeah.
It's oof.
Yeah. It's big. And it's something if you have 2 minutes or 20 minutes to spare, it's something that's there and accessible.
Yeah. So something that I love talking about towards the end of the episodes with guests
Mhm.
is self-care. I'm huge on normalizing caring for
Mhm.
ourselves, understanding that that's not always easy to do, but I also think it's something we're worthy of, and just talking about it. What does that look like for you, and how can other moms make self-care just a normal part of their lives?
Yeah, and it's such an interesting question because I feel like a lot of people can have a very conflicted relationship with that idea because there's also a lot of very negative messaging around self care, and it can put so much of the, again, personal responsibility on us. Like, oh, I'm just not happy because I didn't take a bubble bath today, which blah blah blah. That's not it. So for me, the idea of self-care, especially because I'm still in fairly new motherhood and time is like the one resource that's in very short supply, I kind of have taken a reverse approach to self-care in that I am always considering what can I let go of, what can I care about a little bit less, and then what do I really love and can make sure I get more of. So I love being out in the sun. So if I can prioritize even getting out in the sun for 5 minutes, that to me is a win. And then I think another one, this is a very personal one for me, but I'm a very excitable person by nature. And I also want to say yes to everything. That's just the way I am. And so when somebody extends me any kind of invite, and this is my self care, I've had to implement a rule where I tell them, let me get back to you so I can give myself a beat to really consider, like, is this something I currently have space for? I think self care right now for me looks like being very, very protective of the time that I have and not overbooking myself or my kid and making sure that we have a lot of free open space for not only fun and enjoyment and relaxation, but incidentals because I have.
They really
So I
do.
hope that's a good answer because I know it's not super
Yes.
specific.
No, I mean, I literally ask this question to every guest because I just
Okay.
love getting to hear the different ways that we all are caring for ourselves. And that looks so different, but it is so important to know, like, it looks like a lot of different things, not necessarily
It
these
does.
actions you take. So I think it was a beautiful answer. And I think that is really important. You said it's personal to you and the way your personality is, but I think so many of us, have people pleasing tendencies, and we're just
Mhm.
conditioned to say yes to things to be nice women. And
Yeah.
and also
Yeah.
there's things we want to do, right? Sometimes we don't
Yeah.
necessarily have a very realistic view of like what that looks like in the moment, what it looks like to add something else to our plate in the moment when there's already a lot going on. And so I love
Mhm.
that just little tip of like taking the moment and having an automatic response of let me get back to you. And it doesn't mean no. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean you're saying no, but it means you're giving yourself the space away from the excitement, away from the pressure, away from the like,
Mhm.
lack of good judgment of what's probably best for you, to let yourself actually think, is this something I value? Is this going to benefit me? Is it something that I want to give my time to right now, my energy? Do I have enough
Yeah.
time and energy? And then you can still say yes if it is something
Yeah.
that, aligns with all of that. But it also gives you the opportunity to say, no, I can't right now, or I don't want to right now. So I'm going to have you share where listeners can find you because you are
Yeah.
doing incredible work. I know you are going to do a little giveaway for listeners of this episode, and I'd love for you to share, some of the details of that too. And we'll have more information in the show notes. I'll be sharing on Instagram too, just getting us all
Awesome.
involved. But yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, happy to do that. So, from the moment you're listening right now through the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a giveaway, and we'll share links for that so you can enter. And one person's going to randomly be chosen to have a 60-minute private poetry session with me, and that will be completely customized to you. So, I'm going to give an intake form to the winner so I can find out more about where they're at and select a custom poem reading, not custom in that I'm writing it, but just a poem that I feel like would speak to your current circumstances, as well as some prompts to go with it. So that will be going on. And then outside of that, if anybody is curious about social emotional arts poetry therapy work, my website is joinschool.com. My email is hello@joinschool.com. And I'm one of those people that's just not currently on social because I find it overwhelming. So I'm on a break right now with it. But I do have the website, and my email is an open door for anybody that's interested.
I love it. And so anybody who, if you're like me and you heard how these poetry circles work, and obviously I'm sure an individual session is slightly different, but if you are like, wait, yes, this sounds incredible, definitely join that giveaway because you could get a free session to just like really dig into this. And how exciting is that? think this is something every single one of us could really benefit from. So again, we'll have more information on that in the show notes, and on Instagram, I'll be posting. You will see more information about that there. This is such exciting work that you're doing. It's so powerful and like cool. Like, I just feel like it's so cool, like what you're bringing to the world and to
Oh, thank
motherhood
you.
support. So thank you for being here and sharing that all with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me and letting me share.
Yeah. And everybody listening, you are worthy, Mama.